Frank Bruno was Britain's beloved heavyweight champion, a man whose heart power and personality made him a national treasure. With his thunderous punches and unshakable determination, he captivated fans and became a household name. He went toe-to-toe with some of the greatest fighters of all time, including Mike Tyson and Lennox Lewis, battling for glory in the most brutal sport on earth. But behind the bright lights of his career lay a darker story, one of financial struggles, personal hardships, and a relentless battle against mental illness. Fame, the cheers, the championship belt. None of it could shield him from the harsh reality that awaited him. After boxing, once the cameras stopped rolling and the crowds disappeared, Bruno was left to fight his toughest opponent, yet himself. This is the tragic reality of Frank Bruno at 63 years old, a man who gave everything to the sport, only to be left struggling in its unforgiving aftermath. Frank Bruno wasn't just a fighter. He was a national icon. His charm-termination and devastating power won over the hearts of millions. From the moment he stepped into the ring, fans knew they were witnessing something special. Born on November 16, 1961, in London, England, Bruno grew up in a working-class family, facing the struggles of everyday life. But from an early age, he had one thing that set him apart: an undeniable hunger to fight to win, and to rise above the hardships that surrounded him. Boxing became his escape, his salvation, and his way to prove to the world that he was destined for greatness. When Bruno turned professional in 1982, boxing world took notice. He was a powerhouse, a heavyweight with explosive knockout power and a larger-than-life personality. His early career was a spectacle, fight after fight, opponent after opponent, all falling to his thunderous punches. He won 21 consecutive fights, most of them by knockout, quickly becoming one of the most feared and exciting fighters in the division. His journey to the top was thrilling, filled with moments of triumph and setbacks that only fueled his determination. Bruno's name became synonymous with British boxing fans, packed arenas eager to watch him in action, and millions tuned in on television. But while his star was rising, he faced an uphill battle to claim the ultimate prize, a world championship. He had multiple chances, stepping into the ring with legends like Tim Witherspoon and Mike Tyson only. To fall short, each loss was heartbreaking. But Bruno refused to give up. He trained harder, pushed himself further, knowing that one day his moment would come. And then, in 1995, after years of setbacks and disappointments, that moment finally arrived. Standing across from him was Oliver McCall, the reigning WBC heavyweight champion. Mistakes couldn't have been higher for Bruno. This wasn't just another fight. It was his redemption, his chance to silence the critics and finally claim the title he had chased for over a decade. The fight was grueling, but Bruno's willpower was unbreakable. When the final bell rang, the crowd erupted. The judge's decision was unanimous. Frank Bruno was the new heavyweight champion of the world. The victory was more than just a title win. It was a moment of national pride. Britain had a new heavyweight champion, and his name was Frank Bruno. Fans celebrated across the country, and Bruno stood tall-belt, draped over his shoulder, soaking in the cheers of the people who had supported him through every battle. It was the crowning achievement of his career, the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. But in boxing, no victory lasts forever. As Bruno stood at the of his career, he had no idea that the hardest fights were still ahead, not inside the ring, but in the world beyond it. Frank Bruno gave everything to the sport. But boxing is unforgiving. The brutal punishment he endured in the ring would leave lasting effects, ones that he would struggle with for the rest of his life. For years, he had battled his way to the top, overcoming setbacks and heartbreaks, but once he became champion, the challenges only intensified in the heavyweight division. There's no room for weakness, and for Bruno, the toughest fights were still ahead. Throughout his career, Bruno faced some of the greatest heavyweights of all time. He fought warriors, legends, men who would go down in history as some of the most dominant fighters to ever step foot in the ring. And in that company, Bruno was always seen as the underdog, the fighter with the heart of a lion. But the vulnerabilities that his opponents were always looked to exploit, among those who tested him the most, was the ferocious and unstoppable Mike Tyson. Their first encounter in 1989 was one of the most highly anticipated fights of the decade. Tyson, the undisputed champion at the time, was at the peak of his powers, a knockout machine that had torn through everyone in his path. Bruno stepped in with determination, hoping to shock the world. The fight started with chaos. Bruno was rocked early, but he did something few others had managed against Tyson. He fought back. He landed a stunning left hook in the first round that briefly shook Tyson, sending the crowd into a frenzy. But that moment of hope was short-lived. Tyson regrouped and unleashed his signature aggression, overwhelming Bruno with speed, power, and precision. Bruno's defense was exposed, his inability to absorb Tyson's relentless attacks becoming painfully clear by the fifth round. The inevitable happened. Tyson trapped him against the ropes and unloaded a barrage of punches, forcing the referee to step in and stop the fight. It was a brutal loss, and though Bruno had shown heart, he had also revealed his biggest weakness. He struggled against elite opponents who could take his power and hit him back even harder. Years later, after finally winning the WBC heavyweight title, Bruno's toughest challenge awaited him. Once again, a rematch with Mike Tyson in 1996. But this wasn't the same. Bruno, who had fought his way to the top. This was a man whose body had endured years of punishment, a champion who knew he was stepping into the ring with a predator ready to reclaim his throne. Tyson had returned from prison with one goal: to destroy anyone in his path. And unfortunately for Bruno, he was the next target. The fight was a nightmare from the opening bell. Tyson came out like a wrecking ball, showing no mercy. Bruno, who had spent years preparing for this moment, seemed helpless against Tyson's relentless assault. His once powerful punches had no effect, and his body could no longer withstand the damage. In just 3 brutal rounds, it was over. Tyson crushed him with a series of devastating shots, and Bruno's dream of being a long reigning champion was shattered in an instant. The loss wasn't just a defeat, it was the end of his career. Doctors soon confirmed what Bruno already knew: his body couldn't take any more punishment. Severe eye damage, including a detached retina, made it too dangerous for him to continue fighting, with no choice but to walk away. Bruno retired in 1996 for the record of 40 wins, 38 by knockout, and only 5 losses. He had given everything to the sport, but the sport had taken its toll. The physical punishment, the concussions, the years of absorbing some of the hardest punches in boxing history. These were wounds that wouldn't heal with time for the fans. Bruno would always be a hero, but behind the scenes, his struggles were only beginning. The damage he had sustained in the ring wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, and financial. He had survived some of the most punishing battles in heavyweight history, but as he stepped away from the ring, he was left with a haunting question. What comes next? And that for Frank Bruno was a fight he never could have prepared for. Frank Bruno fought some of the toughest men in the world, but his biggest fight came outside the ring, struggling with mental illness and financial hardship. The beloved champion faced his darkest day. Boxing had given him fame, respect, and a place in history, but it had also taken a devastating toll. The punches he endured, the sacrifices he made, they didn't just disappear. When he retired, instead, they followed him into the next chapter of his life, haunting him in ways he never could have imagined. Despite being one of Britain's most celebrated fighters, Bruno never made the kind of money that modern boxers do in the 1980s and 1990s. Heavyweight boxing wasn't yet a billion-dollar business. Fighters earned big paydays, but they didn't have the financial security that today's champions enjoy. And for Bruno, poor financial management, bad investments, and a lack of long-term planning led to a rapid decline in his wealth. The money that once seemed endless started slipping through his fingers. At one point, the man who had once held the heavyweight championship of the world was forced to sell his mansion just to cover his debts. The luxury, the security, it was all gone, but as bad as his financial troubles were, they were nothing compared to the battles raging inside his own mind. Retirement left a void in his life that he didn't know how to fill for years. Boxing had given him purpose, structure, and an outlet for his energy. Without it, he felt lost. The cheers of the crowd were gone, the adrenaline of fight night had disappeared, and Bruno found himself spiraling into depression. His struggles weren't just temporary. They were signs of something much deeper. In 2003, his condition reached a breaking point, diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Bruno was sectioned under the Mental Health Act and admitted to a psychiatric hospital. The news shocked the public. The man who had once stood tall in the ring, the fighter who had taken on the most fearsome heavyweights of all time, was now in a hospital battling demons. No opponent could see pictures of Bruno, looking frail and disoriented, made headlines, and for many fans it was heartbreaking to see their childhood hero in such a vulnerable state. The stigma surrounding mental health, especially for athletes, made his struggle even more difficult for years. He had been celebrated as a symbol of strength, but now he was being ridiculed by tabloids that sensationalized his con. In addition, some called him bonkers, Bruno, a cruel nickname that only made his battle more painful. But through it all, he fought. He underwent treatment, spoke openly about his struggles, and slowly worked to rebuild his life, while Bruno worked to regain control over his mental health. The physical damage he had suffered in the ring was becoming impossible to ignore. Years of absorbing, punishing blows had left permanent scars. Reports suggested he was showing signs of early onset, CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, degenerative brain disease that has affected many former fighters. Symptoms like memory loss, speech difficulties, and erratic behavior became more pronounced. The same punches that had thrilled crowds during his career were now costing him his health. Despite everything he had been through, Bruno refused to give up. He turned his pain into a mission, becoming an advocate for mental health awareness and encouraging others to seek help. He shared his story, hoping that by speaking out he could help others who were silently suffering. He wrote a book, gave interviews, and used his platform to break the stigma around mental illness. But no matter how much progress he made, the reality remained. his post-boxing life was far from the fairy tale ending that fans had hoped for. Frank Bruno had conquered the boxing world, but outside the ring, he was fighting battles that no championship belt could fix. The ring had given him purpose, but it had also taken a piece of him that he could never get back. And as he continued to navigate the struggles of life after boxing, one thing was painfully clear. The hardest fights don't always happen in the ring. Frank Bruno is still fighting, this time not against opponents in the ring, but against the effects of his brutal career. While he's tried to rebuild, the shadows of his past still will haunt him for years. He stood as a symbol of strength, a warrior who never backed down from a challenge. But when the final bell rang on his boxing career, the battles didn't stop. Instead, they became more personal, more painful, and far harder to win. One of his toughest fights came not in the ring, but in his personal life. In the early two, Bruno's marriage fell apart, leading to a painful and public divorce. The man who had once stood on top of the world was now facing the collapse of his family life. His struggles with mental health only made things worse, and as he battled his demons, his relationship with his children became strained. His darkest years saw him isolated, cut off from the people who once stood by his side. The weight of his past, his mistakes, and his suffering pushed him further into a spiral that seemed impossible to escape. But Bruno was never the kind of man to stay down, even when it seemed like the world had turned its back on him. He refused to let his struggles define him over time. He found the courage to speak out, to share his pain with the world, and to use his story to help others. He became an advocate for mental health awareness, fighting to break the stigma that had once led to him being mocked and ridiculed. He told his story openly, hoping that by doing so he could inspire others to seek help and avoid the same mistakes. In his autobiography, Bruno laid everything bare: the highs, the lows, the moments of triumph, and the years of suffering that followed. It was a brutally honest account of what life after boxing can look like, a reminder that even the strongest men can be broken by the sport they love. His words resonated with fans, showing them that behind the iconic smile and booming laugh was a man who had endured more than most could ever imagine as part of his journey to reclaim his life. Bruno began making public appearances again. Slowly but surely, he regained some of the confidence that had once made him one of Britain's most beloved athletes. He attended events, spoke at mental health seminars, and reconnected with the fans who had supported him throughout his career. Seeing him back in the spotlight was a moment of hope, proof that even in the darkest times there was still a path forward. But despite his progress, the scars of his past remain. The physical toll of his boxing career continues to haunt him. The years of taking punches from some of the hardest hitters in the world left damage that no amount of recovery can fully undo. Reports suggest he still struggles with memory loss, speech difficulties, and other long-term neurological issues at times. He appears frail, a shadow of the powerful fighter he once was. Financial instability is another battle he still faces, unlike modern fighters who can retire with generational wealth. Bruno was never given that kind of security. He still works, still pushes forward, but the harsh reality is that he never received the financial safety net that other sporting legends enjoy. Despite his status as one of Britain's most famous athletes, he has been left to fend for himself, relying on public appearances and book sales to stay afloat. Frank Bruno's story is one of resilience, but also one of heartbreak. He has fought back time and time again, refusing to let his struggles defeat him. Yet even as he continues to stand tall, the ghosts of his past linger. The sport that made him a champion also left him with wounds that will never fully heal. And while he remains a beloved figure, the world often forgets the price he paid for greatness. His fight is far from over, and as he moves forward, one question remains. How much more can he endure? Frank Bruno's story is one of triumph, but also tragedy. He gave everything to boxing, but the sport didn't give back when he needed it most. His struggles should be a wake-up call for all fighters. Glory fades, but the consequences of the ring last forever. The roaring crowds, the championship belts, the moments of victory. They were all part of his journey. But when the cameras shut off and the sport moved on, Bruno was left behind, forced to fight a battle that no title could prepare him for. Unlike modern boxing superstars, Bruno never had the luxury of multi-million-dollar contracts, sponsorship deals, or pay-per-view earnings that could secure his financial future in today's era. Elite fighters like Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, and Deontay Wilder make tens of millions per fight with endorsement deals that provide income long after they leave the ring. But for Bruno, those opportunities simply weren't there. His career took place in a different time when boxers fought for passion and pride, but rarely walked away with the kind of wealth that ensured lifelong security. The harshest reality was that no major organization stepped in to support him when he needed it most. The same sport that had celebrated his rise and profited from his battles was nowhere to be found when his health and finances began to crumble. No governing body offered assistance, no foundation ensured he had access to medical care, and no safety net was in place to help him transition to life outside the ring. For a man who had dedicated his entire life to boxing, realization that the sport had nothing left to offer him was devastating. Bruno wasn't alone in this struggle. Many fighters from his era suffered the same fate, left to fend for themselves, dealing with the long-term consequences of a career that took more than it gave back. Other legends, like Mike Tyson and Lennox Lewis, managed to rebuild their lives through business ventures, media appearances, and financial advisors who helped them secure wealth after retirement. But Bruno never had that same guidance, never had the infrastructure in place to protect him once his fighting days were over. Despite being one of the most beloved fighters in British history, was largely forgotten by the industry that once praised him. His story is more than just a personal tragedy. It's a cautionary tale for every young fighter stepping into the ring. The reality is that for every champion who retires with millions, there are dozens to leave the sport with nothing. The physical toll of boxing is immense, but the financial and emotional toll can be even greater. Fighters dedicate their lives to the sport, sacrificing their health, their bodies, and often their futures. But when their time is up, many find themselves lost without direction, without income, and without the support they need to rebuild. Bruno's struggles should serve as a warning. No matter how great a fighter is, boxing moves on the sport that wants to find them. We'll find new stars, new champions, and new names to celebrate. Fighters must prepare for life beyond the ring, ensuring they have financial stability, medical care, and a plan for what comes next. Because once the final bell rings, the hardest fight of all begins, the fight to secure a future outside the ring. Frank Bruno's story is one of resilience, heartbreak, and survival. He is a fighter in every sense of the word, continuing to battle the consequences of his brutal career. But his struggles should not be in vain if his journey teaches anything. It's that boxing must do better to protect its own, The sport owes its champions more than just a moment in the spotlight. It owes them a future, and until that changes, stories like Bruno's will continue to be written long after the lights go out and the crowds disappear.